What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with She-Hulk Episode 2, Easter eggs, breakdowns, all the stuff you missed, and I still love this show. I think this show's still hilarious. I love the legal comedy aspect of it, right? I think it's great. I think we're being a little too comedic with the MCU, right? I'm kind of looking to get back to when things are just kind of serious, you know what I mean? But I do love the show. I'm having a great time watching it, and there's just these funny moments, right? So, of course, this episode's gonna have spoilers, or this video's gonna have spoilers, different things like that. But one of the funny things about this is She-Hulk basically gets sacked by the DA's office because her turning into the She-Hulk, while it does save lives, it results in them basically having the case thrown out, right? It's a mistrial. And so as a result of that, she's just kind of like she's job hunting, which is sort of the basis behind this episode, like trying to find a new job. You do get a really cool moment where she effectively is hired on. But one of the funny things that happens here is there's a moment where she's talking with her friend and asking about like the Avengers, right? Whether or not they offer things like pension and pay and all that kind of stuff, normal employee benefits. Now, a lot of people are chalking this little bit of an Easter egg up to like the money problems that Sam Wilson had. I don't think it is. I think it's actually a reference to Avengers Disassembled. And the reason why is because in that story in the comics, that story was actually the lead up to really like House of M, the Scarlet Witch going crazy and altering reality. But the Avengers Disassembled for a variety of reasons, right? Thor was out of the picture due to the fact that he died or was dying in Ragnarok. That whole situation was going on. But for the Avengers themselves, they effectively disbanded because Tony Stark had been bankrolling the team for years, right? He was the guy who was paying for the Avengers to exist. Their base of operations, all their healthcare, everything, right? He was covering all that kind of stuff. There came a point in the story when the Scarlet Witch had manipulated reality, specifically Tony Stark, to make him appear drunk in front of the United Nations. This caused the stock value of Stark Industries to absolutely plummet because the world's perception was that Stark had relapsed, right? The Stark had fallen back into alcoholism, which is kind of a throwback to the old demon in a bottle storyline where seemingly his alcoholism had gotten the better of him. And so because of that, he couldn't afford to pay for the Avengers anymore, and they ultimately disbanded, right? So it's kind of a reference to that. Of course, in the MCU, this is more based on the idea that like Tony Stark is dead. And so because Tony Stark has passed away, there doesn't seem to be a provision within Stark Industries or what would pass for Stark Industries now that Pepper Potts is most likely running it, that would lead to a continued funding of the Avengers. We don't specifically know if that's the case. And honestly, I think that'll be answered once we get to what would effectively be like the new Avengers in the MCU, which is undoubtedly coming, although I'm surprised they're just calling it Avengers Dynasty or Kang Dynasty and Avengers Secret Wars. But regardless here, one of the other big things that happens, and this is kind of the big Easter egg and the talking point that everybody is addressing here, is that there comes a point when Jennifer Walters is basically job hunting. She's surfing the web with her friend, and on this browser page that she's looking at, there are a ton of Easter eggs, all kinds of Easter eggs. And it's kind of funny because it's sort of the MCU's way of addressing some of the questions that we've been asking, and even the show does that to a degree, but it's a way to address a lot of the questions that we've been asking as the fan base in terms of what's going on with the greater MCU, because they simply haven't addressed it yet, right? So there are things like Find Ant-Man, right, stuff like that, things that talk about the Avengers, Norse mythology. There's an ad for the Iron Man 3 sneakers, which I'm not even gonna lie, I kind of hope like Marvel and Disney actually release those. If they do, they'll sell out in an instant, so I'm really hoping I can get my hands on some, and because if I don't, they're gonna hit eBay for like $5,000 a piece, and people are going to buy them. I'll probably be one of the people who are stupid enough to do so, but at the end of the day, I have a hard time believing I'll pay $5,000 for shoes, but you know, that's just the way it goes. At the end of the day, it is cool. One of the headlines reads, "Man fights with metal claws in a bar brawl." Now, this is a cool thing because it's one of the things that we saw when it came to the initial introduction of Wolverine as like a movie character, right? Just in general. In the old Fox X-Men movies, remember, like he was in like a bar brawl. When he was discovered by Rogue out there in the Canadian wilderness, he was basically in a fight club, right? Fighting in like cage matches. And so it was cool to see. It's a funny reference to that, right? It's a really cool reference to that. But bigger than that, what it sounds like is what I and a lot of people have been saying this whole time, which is the X-Men have been here the entire time. Now, if you want to know my theory about the X-Men regarding like how mutants exist in the MCU, I do have a video on that. Make sure you guys go check that out. I basically create this argument that not only have X-Men been here the entire time, or at least mutants have been here the entire time in the MCU, they're actually a branch off of the Deviants from the Eternals. But it's one of those cool things, right? It's one of the things I absolutely love. On that same page, there's actually a sidebar headline line that talks about the giant statue from Eternals, right? Like Tiamat, the dreaming celestial who's just half sitting out of the, like literally like the ocean is a bathtub, right? He's just half sitting in it. And so it's one of those cool things because that's never been addressed. Now, I think there are probably better ways to address this than anything else. It's not like Tiamat could only be seen by a handful of people, and so it's like tabloid magazines in the Men in Black movie where they're actually preaching truth, but nobody believes it. You know what I mean? Like that kind of a thing. Like anybody can go there. Honestly, I think it'd be a hilarious thing if in the MCU, name of the Submariner and the Atlanteans are living in Tiamat, right? Like how you have like little statues and stuff and like a fish tank. That's basically what Tiamat is in like the ocean for like the Atlanteans. They just took up squatters' rights inside of a dead celestial, and they've been living there for a while now. I think that'd be hilarious, but it is cool to see that, right? It is cool to see that they are at least referencing that, and honestly, it kind of astounds me that they're doing it in kind of a throwaway moment that you would actually have to look for, as opposed to like a sort of broad-based thing where it's like a news article that happens, right? I mean, this would have been the perfect time to do it, right? It would have been a perfect time to do it at the, you know, when they were doing like those little news segments opening the show, and people are still wondering what's going on with the giant statue sticking out of the ocean, right? It's just one of those things where I think the MCU is kind of playing it back and forth. They're playing it sort of careful with the Eternals, like they may not necessarily keep it all in continuity, right? They may just kind of shuffle it off, hope people kind of forget about it, and that's basically it. But again, I doubt that's the case, right? The Eternals film, regardless of the fact that it basically sucked, was an exceedingly important film because of like the standard that it set, the idea of invoking like the familial relations with like Thanos, Eros being an Eternal, who's kind of the adopted brother of Thanos, things like that. It has its fingers that kind of stretch out into everything, so they can't really get rid of it per se. But again, I feel like they could have done a little bit more over this time than just sort of making it a kind of thing that exists out there. Now, as for the company GLK&H, that company does exist in the comics, and it was actually established during Dan Slott's She-Hulk run back in 2004. The guy Holden Holloway, the one who approached She-Hulk in the TV show, he exists in the comics as well. But there are differences between the comics and how things unfold here in the show. A really good example is that in the TV show, Holden Holloway wanted to bring in She-Hulk as the She-Hulk, and he wanted her to lead the superhuman division. In the comics, it wasn't that way. He thought that She-Hulk was a little too reckless, too much flight of fantasy. He wanted the actual Jennifer Walters, who was the ridiculously skilled lawyer. So you didn't really see that play out in the show. The other motivation behind this is that instead of using GLK&H as a way to basically launch a superhuman division and effectively bolster their pocketbooks, right? Because superheroes are gonna need legal representation. In the comics, the daughter of Holden Holloway ended up becoming a villain named Southpaw. And in order to ensure she could be adequately represented, that the entire superhuman law division was established by Holloway, and She-Hulk was hired on to lead that division in order to ensure that Southpaw, that his daughter Sasha, would basically be represented to the best of anybody's ability, because no one really knew how to represent superheroes. Now, the bigger takeaway from this, and the reason why this Easter egg is so important, is because this potentially leads into the introduction of groups like Landau, Luckman, and Lake. Now, for people who are really familiar with Marvel Comics, and when I say really familiar, I mean like you know your stuff, right? Like you're on like my level or more knowledgeable when it comes to comics. You know exactly who Landau, Luckman, and Lake is. If you don't know anything about comics, here's who they are. This is an organization that has their hands in everything. They pitch themselves in a variety of different ways, but the reality is that they are just this super clandestine organization that seeks to guide the path of humanity into whatever future that may hold. But the way in which they do this is through a series of like holding companies, some of which are legal companies, right? Like the Landau, Luckman, and Lake law firm. Some of them are companies that basically use individuals as agents, either wittingly or unwittingly. People like Captain America, for example, have been agents of Landau, Luckman, and Lake, albeit he didn't necessarily know. Wolverine is the most popular example of that. And in fact, Landau, Luckman, and Lake and their relationship with Wolverine is so strong that they actually hold a lot of the personal belongings of Wolverine should it become a situation where he can't have a normal life for himself, right? Like there's nowhere for him to put them. He's been an agent for them on a multitude of occasions. And in fact, during Chris Claremont's run back in the 80s, there were a lot of stories that dealt with Wolverine and Landau, Luckman, and Lake. Now, whether or not we're actually gonna see that play out in the MCU, I'm not entirely sure. It's way too early to know if that's the case or not, but it would be cool to see some kind of intergalactic holding company that offers itself as a kind of counter, or maybe something akin to like a competing law firm in the United States or on Earth, and it's just Landau, Luckman, and Lake. That'd be awesome. If you see that, you know exactly what that means. What that means is you're likely going to see Wolverine involved with them, right? That's going to be a cool thing. Like, for example, if the MCU really wanted to bring in that group, in that instance where you have the Easter egg where it talks about the guy with 3 claws, right, with metal claws who gets in a bar fight, that he's basically apprehended by authorities by whatever manner, whatever means, presumably damage control, and that he's being represented by Landau, Luckman, and Lake. So that'd be cool. It'd be interesting to see. If that were going to happen, because Wolverine's so popular, it would likely be he'd be represented by She-Hulk, but I gotta tell you right now, I have a hard time believing that Wolverine will make his debut in the Marvel Cinematic Universe in the She-Hulk show. I just don't see that happening. It might, right? Never say never. I just don't see that happening. But the other cool thing is that you actually have Jennifer Walters, who of course calls Bruce Banner about Emil Blonsky. And we all knew that was going to happen. We all knew that conversation was going to take place somewhere along the line, whether it was before she took the case, while she had the case, or after she took the case and the whole thing was done. We knew that conversation was going to unfold. I did love the entire exchange between She-Hulk and Emil Blonsky. I absolutely loved it. I loved it like he's turned over a new leaf. Of course, She-Hulk's reference to Silence of the Lambs was really funny, right? You know, like, is he gonna serve me, serve a nice Chianti and yada, yada, yada. I love that whole thing. That was a funny little moment. But I love the whole exchange between the two, right? Emil Blonsky, like, writing haikus, trying to read them, and She-Hulk just being like, no, I'm not, I don't want to hear that. I loved that. It's interesting to see Emil Blonsky turning over a new leaf that way, but I felt like this exchange and the conversation with Bruce Banner was more important than people initially gave it credit for. That while it was funny and while it did have some interesting interactions, the reality about this is that it basically consolidates everything that went on with the original Edward Norton Incredible Hulk film. And they've kind of done that to a degree, right? Like Thunderbolt Ross showing up in the MCU proper after that original Incredible Hulk film. People were kind of wondering where that film resides in continuity. Is it even in continuity at all, right? The fact that Thunderbolt Ross had shown up essentially established that. The idea that that Bruce Banner had initially turned down the offer to join the Avengers because he quote-unquote broke Harlem, that was a reference to the Incredible Hulk film. So we got these little references here and there, and as time has gone on, we know that movie is actually in continuity. And one of the cool things is, of course, you get a reference from Banner saying like, well, I was a different man during that point in time, literally, which obviously is a reference to the fact that Edward Norton had played Bruce Banner before Mark Ruffalo had come along. But I did love that whole thing with Blonsky, right? Like, it looks like he legitimately is trying to be a good guy. It looks like he legitimately is trying to turn over a new leaf. Now, whether or not that bodes well for him by the fact that he has essentially escaped with Wong and that it shows him in the cage match during the Shang-Chi film, I don't know how well that's going to go for him. But I do love that whole situation with Emil Blonsky. I love what they're doing with his character. Now, one of the cool things here is that whole scene with Emil Blonsky, where it shows that he's escaped and that he's in the cage match, that took place during Shang-Chi. That tells us exactly where the TV show resides, and it happens alongside Shang-Chi. And that's why I say this whole situation with Emil Blonsky in the third act of this episode is incredibly important, because what this establishes, if it hasn't established it already, is that the Marvel Cinematic Universe is heavily playing the comic book game in terms of how they release their films and TV shows. It wasn't like that. In the first 10 years of the MCU, with the exception of maybe 1 or 2 movies, if that, it all followed a linear chronology. It all followed a straightforward chronology. And if things were out of continuity, meaning that the newest movie was not directly after or taking place during the previous movie, that they would tell us in that movie. With the TV shows, it's a little murky sometimes, because what they're doing now is they're releasing the movies and the TV shows the same way Marvel Comics releases their comic books, the same way they publish their comics. So the best way to follow the Marvel Cinematic Universe right now is to treat it as though it's a movie version of a Marvel Comics publishing initiative, right? They're releasing their movies and TV shows the same way Marvel Comics releases their comic books, tie-ins and main events, things like that. So you can largely look at all the movies that we get, right? Everything after the events of Infinity War and Avengers Endgame, running all the way up to Avengers Secret Wars and the Kang Dynasty and all that kind of stuff. You can treat that as quote-unquote the main story arc. And then the TV shows are the tie-in comics. They fill in the gaps in between and let us know what's taking place between the main events that are taking place in the films in the MCU. It's the easiest way to approach it, and it's the best way to make it make the most sense. But it is an important thing, and it is a cool moment that we get to see there with all that stuff kind of being reconciled and being explained. Now, that's kind of the cool thing, is because again, we also find out that the Incredible Hulk is effectively going to Sakaar, right? So that'll likely pick up with Planet Hulk. A lot of people have been saying that's what's going to happen, that the Marvel Cinematic Universe is building up to a proper Planet Hulk and World War Hulk event. Again, as far as I'm aware, the only thing that's come out about that is they're just kind of kicking the idea around generally, and that's essentially it. But they haven't really established anything etched in stone. I don't know exactly how this is going to unfold. I think that the rumors that are circulating around out there is that Planet Hulk and World War Hulk will basically be a TV series. Other rumors are saying it's going to actually be a film. But, you know, as far as that goes, it's just kind of speculation. I'm not really sure. But again, overall, I love the show, right? They were just funny little meta commentary things, right? You know, like, for example, when Jennifer Walters is talking to her friend about how she's a little frustrated because there's more to her than She-Hulk, it's kind of like, I mean, is there though? Because you were basically like every white girl ever on the face of the planet. If I stuck you in a room with 500 other white chicks, there's nothing about you that would stand out. But you're the She-Hulk now, right? It's like the thing about you that makes you unique. Outside of that, you were just a white chick who was a lawyer, and that's it. There's like a million of those. Either that or like a journalist. So it's one of those things where like I love that that whole situation where it's her just kind of having a hard time leaning into the thing that makes her unique. Honestly, I think it's because it just sort of takes her away from everything she's known, because her life is forever, like it's irrevocably altered. There's no going back. There's no unringing this bell. There's no going back to a time when she's just Jennifer Walters. That was literally the whole first episode. What she wanted more than anything was to go back to the life that she had before, even though it was wildly mundane. The fact is, like, with her being She-Hulk now, her life is infinitely more interesting. It's more dangerous, but it's also more interesting than it ever was before. And what this does is it really presents this notion of Jennifer Walters just kind of holding on to this last bastion. It's the same way things play out in her comics, and it's actually what made her comics really interesting under Dan Slott. There will likely come a time in the TV show when the Marvel Cinematic Universe will adapt the stories from She-Hulk, where basically Jennifer Walters stops being Jennifer Walters and just stays the She-Hulk full time. That will likely happen. Again, her being in the MCU also does present the possibility that at some future point in time, she can replace Ben Grimm on the Fantastic Four. I'm sure that'll piss a lot of people off, but it'll be kind of interesting because they'll be like, that's ridiculous, right? As a comic book fan, that does not need to happen. And it'll be like, but it did though. It did happen in the comics. You don't know that because you don't know anything about comics, but it did happen in the comics. So it's gonna be one of those funny moments. I'm kind of curious to see how that unfolds. I will be frothing at the mouth with a chance to make fun of those guys. But at the end of the day, I do love the show. I think it's a phenomenal show. It's hilarious so far. I'm absolutely loving the whole thing, and I'm excited to see how it ends. With that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.